Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. This is episode 110 of the Meet the Farmers podcast, and I'm your host, Ben Eagle. I'm conscious that we haven't been north on the show for a little while, so we're going to write that today, and we're off to England's largest county, Yorkshire, and I'm joined by arable farmer Richard Bramley, who farms 230 hectares just south of York itself. Richard, thanks for coming on the show.
Yes, thank you very much for this unusual opportunity to, talk about yourself, which is
Yeah.
quite bizarre experience, I'm sure.
Oh well, no, honestly, thanks for coming on. I mean, tell us about your part of the world first of all. What's the landscape like?
A lot of people come here and say it's flat, but when you know your fields, we have what we call hills, which might be sort of 2 or 3 feet higher at one end than the other, but it's definitely uphill. The farm itself is on the edge of a village of Kelfield, and Kelfield itself is beside the River Ouse, which comes south out of York, and we farm just where the River Wharfe joins the Ouse. And then we've got another block of land which is due east at Rickall. The soils are, beside the river, it's what we call our warp land, which is a alluvial silty clay, classed as grade 1, very productive.
So beautiful.
I have this sort of like saying that if you treat it with respect, it looks after you. Don't try and make it do anything it doesn't want to do, because you'll be beaten very quickly. So you learn that fairly quickly. And then the bulk of the rest, with a few sort of more clay areas, is classic sort of Vale of York sand. There's a lot of history in the area. It's the place where the Viking longships parked up on the side of the River Ouse to go and battle at Stamford Bridge.
Oh, fantastic.
So there's a lot of artifacts. I won't say we're plagued. We do get a lot of people interested in metal detecting.
I can imagine.
And they are good enough to show us their wares, which range from Bronze Age upwards. So we've seen some wonderful things. No hoards, though. No.
I was going to say no Sutton Hoo yet.
no, nothing like that. But quite a lot of trees. It's not an exceptionally wooded area, but there's a lot of trees in the landscape, hedgerows. But you don't have to go far before it changes quite a lot, and you start to lose those trees. So, we're a bit of a sweet spot, I think.
Yeah, and that follows through with your cropping. Tell listeners a bit about your cropping. You mentioned a bit about your soils, but what's your rotation, and perhaps how has your rotation changed, if at all, over the years?
The mainstay is the classic wheat, barley, break crop. So we grow sugar beet and potatoes, winter and spring barley, which is a shift because farming by a river. We're one of those farms that has had to get very used to flooding. It's been quite a marked increase. So we've had a shift to spring barley. We've actually found we can grow spring barley as well as winter barley. So that hasn't been too big a deal. And then sugar beet potatoes. The potatoes now are grown for Walker's crisps on contract, and the sugar beet for the usual suspect. I've stopped growing oilseed rape this year for the first time, and have switched to oats, and then we've tried vining peas for the first time this year.
Okay.
We've got some spring beans, which again is part of the replacement for the oilseed rape, and unfortunately some spring wheat, because we lost a lot of our best milling wheat in the flooding.
Yeah.
But in the past, I've grown linseed, I've grown flax, I've grown hemp. So I've tried different things out.
Let's talk a bit about you. Let's go back to your childhood. Did you always want to farm? What sort of child were you?
Well, growing up on a farm, the farm's always around you, so you don't really think about it. As a kid, it doesn't matter where you're brought up. A tractor is still an amazing thing, and you love tractors. And one of the things I really do like now is just driving through local village in a tractor.
Yeah.
if there's a kid there, they either wave or they put their hands over their ears,
Yeah.
or they just stare in amazement. And I think that's something that just hasn't changed. I don't know if that'll ever change.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I don't think we're quite so taken by robots trundling through in decades to come. But I wasn't a kid that grew up in his overalls.
Okay.
I was interested in a lot of things. He was just sort of like there was the farmer. My father was a member of the what was called the Bishop Burton Farm Machinery Club, and
Okay.
they used to meet once a month, and they would get a speaker in, and it was an excuse for them to get together. All these old boys. Well, he probably wasn't that old at the time, but and he said, "Do you want to?" I'd always been interested in geology and rocks and things like that, and there was a talk on soil science.
Okay.
He said, "Do you want to come along to this one? You know, you might be interested." And so a very reluctant 16-year-old lad went with his dad to, to this talk by uh, whoever it was. Can't remember who it was. I've still got the book. I've got the book on my bookshelf
Really?
there. It came from it. But as is such things, there's a chap there who was the principal, I think, at the time, or certainly a lecturer, called Aubrey Davis. And anybody who's got any connection with Bishop Burton will know Aubrey. And he honed in on me when he saw this. You know, whoa, there's a young lad amongst all these old duffers. So he honed in on me. Well, it's fearsome. So what are you going to do? And I just had my O level results, and
Okay.
I'd done fairly well in them. And
That's a
I'd been
relief
thinking, yeah,
in
I'd
that
done.
moment.
Oh, I didn't work. That was the most amazing thing. But he said, "Oh, so what are you going to do? What's your next move?" I said, "Oh, well, I'm going to do my A levels, and then I think I'm going to go and do an HND. It was an HND or an OND."
Okay.
I thought, I think I might do an HND. He said, "Oh, how did you do in your exams?" And I told him, and he said, "You don't want to be going to college. You need to go to university." And I'd never thought about it,
Wow.
never considered it, and it was like, okay, right, that
Wow.
sounds a bit grand.
What difference a moment makes.
And yeah, and that's what I did. And that was quite a key moment.
Yeah. And skipping ahead a bit, you lived in Australia for a while, which is where you met your wife. And while you were there, you worked for a TV station for 6 months. Tell me about that. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, I from school I got enough to get a place at Nottingham University at Sutton Bonington, which was a real fantastic place. I'd say once I got there, I suddenly realised just quite how bad school was, how much I hadn't enjoyed it, and then I'd studied agricultural science as much as anything. It just sort of fitted, and I kind of expected I would end up farming, but as I think you do at that age, I wanted to put it off and I wanted to travel, and I had looked at going to Australia before going to university. And my father's words were, "If you start earning, you won't be able to start learning again." So, so I put it off, and I said, "Right, okay, well, I'll go afterwards."
Okay.
But by then, I'd say, come to terms with the fact I was probably going to be farming. So the last thing I wanted to do was to farm when I went to Australia.
Yeah.
So I went via had a week in Canada and a couple of nights in Hawaii.
Wow.
Nearly missed the plane in Hawaii. But that's a long story. But ended up flying into Sydney. I kept in touch with somebody I was at school with 10 years previous, and they met me off the plane. Took me straight to the pub, and
Good start.
yeah, and I was really I was quite impressed with the place. We would anybody who knows Australia, we were on the rocks in the Hero of Waterloo and the Lord Nelson, which are two great pubs, but not typically Australian. And so I sort of felt a bit more at home. Anyway, I was put up by his family. Went back there it was on a Sunday, and on the Monday I basically slept all day because, well, jet lag and all the rest. And on the Tuesday, I went down to the local employment agency, explained my situation, and so they organised the interview for me the following day, the Wednesday, at a temping agency. And I was welcomed at the temping agency, and the ladies took out this big box of those little index cards, which I don't know if you're probably just not familiar, not used anymore. This big box of index cards, and said, "Oh, well, before we look at the jobs, can you just go over there into one of the bays and do a type test?" I said, "What do you mean? What do you mean by type test?" "Well, we need to know how many words of money you can do." I said, "Well, I can tell you that I can't type." So she basically took this big box of jobs and put it to one side and picked up another one, and there was 3 cards in it. The first one she pulled out, she said, they're looking for somebody to work in the publicity department of SBS Television. "Oh, it's just down the road. How does that sound?" And I said, "Okay, let me give them a call." Within 20 minutes, I was in there. It was a 5-minute interview. "When can you start?" "Oh, in the morning." And I was working the following day.
Amazing.
And I spent 6 months there, and it was fabulous time. And that very same day I started work, it was the property section that came out, and in the paper. So I found a flat and moved into that on the Saturday. And it was one of these ramshackled affairs with lots of people in lots of rooms. One of the rooms came free 3 weeks later, and it happened to be my wife who moved in.
Wow. That's where it happened.
That's how we met. But we were just sort of friends in Australia. She's Irish. She came back to see her parents after I'd come back, and I went over to see her, and then it sort of,
yeah,
that was 30 years ago.
Yeah. And then you came back to the UK. Did you have a plan for what you wanted to do then? Did you intend to go straight back to the family farm?
Yeah, I think I'd sort of, using my words carefully, sort of resigned myself to the fact that was what I was going to do.
Yeah.
Probably when I got back from Australia, my father sat me down, and it was. I don't remember the details of it, but I do remember him saying, "Listen, lad," or words to that effect, "whatever you do, you've got to earn a living, and farming ain't a bad way to do it." One of the things I learned fairly quickly is that managing a farm isn't something you can learn elsewhere.
Yep.
You learn about the place on site.
Yep.
And I think I'd sort of begun to get a feel for that. So I knew I had to, at some point, start to get to grips with it. There was nothing obvious for me else that I was going to pursue. So that's what I did.
Yeah.
And it took a long time before I really realized I'd probably made the right decision.
Yeah. I mean, what was the business like when you first went back?
It was it was an arable farm growing similar sort of crops, but with cattle.
Okay.
So we used to raise stores over winter. So they complemented in some ways. It very much coming back into fashion, but at the time what I had picked up at university was looking at enterprises and how they were performing. So I started to do analysis on things like that and realized they weren't actually making any money.
Yeah.
Plus, it meant that I had to work every day over winter.
Yeah.
So
says an arable farmer.
Yeah, I'd missed out. I'd missed out.
All the dairy farmers right now going, "Oh yeah."
But I've missed out on all the other benefits that stock brought. but that's just, I was in my early 20s. I was sort of brought up on gross margins and, and applying fertilizers, and that was just the way, and pesticides, and that was just the way you were.
Yeah.
And that's what your focus was, driving efficiencies and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So,
and then jumping ahead a bit, you do a fair bit of conservation work on the farm. Have you always had an interest in the environment, in wildlife?
Yes, I always have. I'm not a yogurt knitting,
You don't need
sandal
to
wearing
justify it.
type. I'm a practical environmentalist, in that, I like. My father always liked putting in a few trees and some hedges every winter. That was like just a thing that
Yep.
he liked doing. We carried that on, and I started looking at stewardship schemes in the 90s. Didn't like them. I found them very clunky, and I didn't warm to them. And then we started to see the broad and shallow approach, which the Curry report put forward, which led into ELS, and they fitted us an awful lot better. And in fact, they actually became quite frustrating because I wanted the ELS scheme to allow for farmers to develop what they'd done. So, and the only thing you could do was to jump straight into HLS.
Yeah.
So it was a one or the other.
Yep.
And we put a very comprehensive HLS scheme together when grain was sort of £70 a ton, and it just about stacked up, but it was kicked out because of a funding issue. It was something went on in Europe. And within 6 months, grain was £140 a ton.
Yep.
The whole thing would have looked a monumental bad move.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of work for actually losing money. And that's when I started, the cogs start to think about, well, how could this work better? And then you start getting involved with things when you have ideas, and you get frustrated that people aren't sort of like taking them up. So you start to do them yourself.
Yep.
So I complemented a lot of work that we did through the entry level scheme with voluntary stuff and trying different things out, and that all sort of like intermingled with the surveying work that we started.
Yeah, I was going to say, can we talk about that? Because I mean, you've got a lot of data now, going back several years. Talk me through those surveys and what you've learnt through them.
The rationale was, before we went into any schemes, before we actually started to manage areas to improve the biodiversity, because that's what it was all about, biodiversity. That was the main sort of drive. I thought, well, what have we got? Let's start by finding out what we've got. And it happened that a friend from university was also a very keen bird watcher.
Right.
And at the time, the RSPB were doing a Volunteer Farmer Alliance initiative, which was a really good initiative, which meant that they twinned an enthusiast volunteer with a farmer, and they did a survey. Consisted of 2 sites, 3 surveys from, I think it's probably April, May, and June. It all went on a map, so it was all very visual. And we had some very important key species, and that was, oh, right, okay, so there's actually something here we can really work on. So we then thought, well, we need to give it time to work. So we repeated it 5 years later, and we'd increased bird numbers by 20%,
Wow.
species numbers by 20%.
Yeah.
And the map went from having, quite a few reasonable dots and obvious breeding activity to suddenly being covered in birds.
Huh.
And that was like, blimey, we've hit on something. We've done a bit, we've added a bit to it, and we started playing around with a few other things. So that led me to do more voluntary stuff, because there wasn't the scope within the scheme.
Okay.
So most of the scheme money went straight back into voluntary work. It wasn't actually adding anything to us. But around about 2000 and 7, so fairly early on, I'd started dabbling with cover crops,
Okay.
not appreciating the wider benefits of cover crops.
Yeah, I was going to say
But
that was ahead of its time.
yeah, I began from a biodiversity point of view because I thought, okay, overwinter stubble we never put into stewardship. We did it anyway. So I thought, well, I'm not going to be if I'm going to be paid to do something that I'm already doing, then I'm not going to improve things. That's where the surveying sort of fitted in.
Okay.
What can I do? But there's more I can do with that stubble. So I'll tell you what, I'll plant blocks of different plants to create different habitats and to create edges. Because I had this idea of, thick edges running onto stubble would be hiding places for
Yep.
things that could flip out into the
Yep.
into the open land, but know they could comfortably get back in if they needed to. Within a couple of years of doing that field scale, and then you start to learn about biocidal activity of certain mustards. So you start to play around with mustards, and then you start to think, but these mustards, they might not be working very well with the rape. So then you start to look at radishes, and then you start to think, well, we could, if we introduce something that flowers better. So you look at, and before you know it, we were growing, I think probably 2010, we were growing trial plots, like full field length trial plots of single species.
Okay.
And hosting events on the farm for local farmers through the campaign for the farmed environment.
Okay. Yeah.
Which I've been involved with from the beginning.
Yeah.
To see which ones performed the best. From there, a couple of years later, creating mixes. And now I've got a fairly established mix that I'm fairly happy with. That we put on about 20-25% of the farm every winter. I've just started catch cropping as well.
Okay.
In between crops, which has again been another revelation.
Yeah.
You learn about nutrient capture, you learn about carbon, and carbon's really becoming a big thing. And the whole clean water. And then you start to, all these light bulbs that have been pinging, just and it's like, oh, blimey, there's a lot going on here.
Where are we turning next? Oh yeah. So I've looked at the website, and you run a quite incredible self-catering business. I really want to come and stay. Having seen some of those photos, it looks amazing. For any listeners out there as well, if you want to look it up, it's dovecookbarnsyork.co.uk. Check it out now. Honestly, how, when, and why did you start that?
My wife is an IT specialist. And when she came here, she got a job with a little starter bank, first telephone bank ever, called First Direct.
Okay.
And when she joined, there was 20 in the IT department, and she was one of their sort of key programmers. And then the big nasty HSBC came in and bought Midland Bank, who owned First Direct.
Right. Okay.
And they wanted her to move to start working in Sheffield. Well, it was a bit of a commute to Leeds as it was, and we had 3 young kids who, thankfully, there was a creche attached to the business. It was a very forward-thinking business, and it was just no, I can't do that, trekking down to Sheffield. So she left that. It was timely for other reasons, but within about 18 months, it was, well, what should we do? And we'd always had our eye on the old barns. 2 of us were interested in renovating, and we didn't have really the skills to do it, but we had the ideas. And we looked at all sorts of options. We liked the idea of self-catering. We felt it was something that we would enjoy, meeting and greeting people on the farm. But we thought we should show due diligence and look into everything else. So we did market research, and we ended up coming back to self-catering, even though it wasn't necessarily the most lucrative. We felt it was the thing that fitted us better. Yeah, we embarked on that. We started the conversions in 2007, opened in December 2008. And I've always been very conscious of our reliance on oil, going back to the early 80s when I first learned about it in geography at school when I was sort of 11, 12 years old. And I thought, oh, this is a bit risky.
Yeah.
You know, it permeates everything that we do. We're totally reliant on it. What happens when it runs out? So so I'd always been concerned about that in a subliminal sort of a way. So we decided that we were going to do this one without reliance on fossil fuels. So we were basically future proofing it.
Yep.
And so that cost more for a start than it needed to do. And we thought, oh well, people will come flocking because they'd like the eco-ness. And it didn't make the blindest bit of difference. People just wanted a good holiday.
Yeah.
But thankfully, we didn't ignore comfort and quality.
Yep.
And 3 years later, we won the best in England for our business.
Amazing.
And we've won the Yorkshire Tourism Awards, very competitive awards, several times, and the York ones as well. So it's and we've just expanded. Done the other barn that we didn't convert at the time before.
Yeah, dare I say? I mean, on that, how's the last year been?
Pass. Well, we were the benefit to being told to shut down was we were converting a building on site.
Okay.
So we were it meant that we actually didn't have to worry about the mess and the noise.
Yep.
So that's let's think of the positives. The positives were it took longer, inevitably, because of supply of things and less people being able to work on site. But we when we were open over summer, people were mindful of the fact that we had guests staying because we were allowed to open for those about 3 months. And by then we got most of the dirty work done. So that was a benefit, but we're very keen to get going again in April.
I bet you are.
Because it's a huge investment and it's built on it giving a return, obviously, to pay for it. So we're keen to get going.
Let's turn to your stuff away from the farm, because you've got a fair few other interests, and you do some stuff with the NFU, for example, but lots of other interests besides. Have you managed to get much hill walking done this year?
Yeah, only a couple of times, because we were so busy last year. We couldn't go away with the conversion. So just a couple of times we've done some longish walks in the area, but not been able to get away with. There's some groups of friends who go away with, and not being able to do that. But I'm a bit worried actually that it's going to be a lot harder work because the COVID stone has unfortunately crept up on me, and most of my social life is generally out of farming, or loosely connected. But one of the real things that I have enjoyed of late is through the involvement with the NFU is getting to know farmers, well, across the country, really. And in other countries as well. I've been lucky enough to be able to speak in countries in Europe, and it's got a really good feel to it as farming. There's a real camaraderie. Sort of sounds like the wrong.
Yeah,
it's probably it's the right word or not, but there's the real sort of like sense of togetherness, if you like, in the industry, which is good to be involved with.
Oh, absolutely. That leads us on really nicely, actually, to the part of the show where we talk about wider industry issues. I asked you to give me a couple of challenges before we started recording. One of these, which I think is a really interesting one, which I think lots of farmers will agree with, is time. Talk this through.
Yeah, despite not having livestock, I I've always felt that I'd be happier with a 9-day week.
Yeah.
7 days of work and then 2 days that you had to just not work.
Yeah, I would go along with that personally, definitely.
Yeah, it's so difficult living and working in the same place, despite the fact that it's obviously so good to just be able to. The commute is literally opening the front door, but you don't switch off.
Yeah,
and so that's why I say time. The problem is, I know what I'm like. I'd probably fill it with something else, just because that's what tends to happen.
yeah,
My wife says I'm somebody who can't say no when I'm asked to do something, but I'm learning that is, you can't just keep
it's an
taking
important
things on.
word. It's a very important word.
But the thing is, I always knew when I started farming that I would need more to keep me engaged. I need that stimulus.
Yep.
And a friend of mine persuaded me to go along to a conference from the Institute of Agricultural Management. It was in York. I think it was 2003 or 2004, thereabouts. Again, I'd never done anything like that before. And he's actually my accountant.
Okay.
I was at university with him. He's based down in Herefordshire, and a great fella. And he was involved in this group. He says, if there's one conference you're going to go to this one. It's it's a good one, and it was very inspiring. You listen to a lot of people talk about things that you can't possibly imagine ever doing, right? And you think, oh God, I crap. I don't do any of this. They're doing this, they're doing that. And anyway, I sat down at dinner next to a lecturer from Newcastle University called Jeremy Franks, and we got talking in a way, and it was around the time of the curry reforms.
Okay.
And I said, well, what do you reckon is going to happen? He said, well, that payment you get every winter, that's going. You're going to get it for the next 5 years.
Wow.
Use it to restructure and do something different, and learn to farm without it. Now, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Because we've still got it. Okay,
That is really interesting.
But that forced me to think and to realize that, okay, hang on, I can't rely on this. So we'd done a few. I took on board business pretty much round about then. I was, we'd had a transition from about 2000, and so we made a few changes. We increased the amount of potatoes. We'd started irrigating potatoes as well, so really trying to do a proper job with them. And it was probably also the spawn for the diversification, because I'd listened to all these characters who'd diversified and done something really well.
Yeah.
And thought, I can't ever possibly be one of them. But it was probably one of those little light bulb moments without realizing it that forced that change. So I feel quite comfortable about certain aspects of the future, because I feel like we're sort of, we're not overly reliant. It's very nice, that payment, but we're not overly reliant on it.
Let's turn towards your farm, challenges on your farm over the next, let's say, 10 years or so. It's difficult to know in that time. But where are you heading? Do you think it'll be business as usual? Will you be adapting or changing anything, or maybe trying anything new?
Well, I'm at the stage in life, although not old, where I feel I'm sort of got to a comfortable position.
Yep.
So I'm not mad keen to be doubling the farm's size or anything like that. It's a good business, which produces good crops on land which I'm continuing to improve. It's been that's been a really good thing to see, is how the land, how much it has improved in the last 15 years. That is going to be about building resilience into what we've got and making the most of what we've got. And I think we're going to need it, because the challenges that the weather's throwing at us
Yep.
means that we might actually not see that in improved crop yields. We might just see it in the business remaining resilient. And then we've got our diversification business, which we've just made a big investment in. We've just made some big investments in the farm as well. But I'm sort of happy now that we've got things to a good stage, and sort of brace yourself really at what's going to be thrown at us. I'm an optimistic person. I think sometimes in farming you have to be naturally optimistic, but I don't ignore the fact that there's an awful lot of people having a lot of trouble out there, and we can't be complacent. People need to understand that outside of farming, they need to understand that we've continued to pedal ever harder. We've got this big debate about farm assurance at the moment. Farms are and have delivered an awful lot
and continue to deliver
and continue to do it. And it is high time that is properly recognised. We shouldn't be receiving support from government. We should see that value in our produce. If I'm growing a ton of wheat in a field which has a floristic margin, a well-managed hedge, an increasing bird count in a soil that's trapping carbon and keeping the water clean and producing wonderful food that is traceable, then that should be worth a lot more than something that's come on a boat from wherever else, where those are not focuses of the production method. That cuts out all the loss in value through taking it through the tax system and delivering it back in some form of a scheme. Ultimately, I've got to say that is the utopian dream that I would see if the produce that we produce from our farms is properly valued.
Yeah.
I don't think I'll see that in the next 10 years,
yeah.
but I like the principle of payment for public goods because it focuses. We've had a subsidy, for want of a better word, a support payment, but it's been a support payment that's been wrapped up in a lot of rules and regulations. So it hasn't been entirely clear to the public that it's anything other than just a payment for occupying land. This refocus really could be like the stepping stone to shifting it down to the value of how much we value the produce of our land, because that ultimately is what we need to protect. If we don't value it, we're not going to protect it, and you end up in a sticky situation in the years to come. We're very lucky in the UK. We've good farmers, good land. As a rule, plenty of water, not always in the right places at the right time, and we can't keep hold of it enough. But we're on a track where we can make the most of that. And I think with a pragmatic, scientific view of all the benefits that technology can bring, then we can really fast track how we can do things so much better.
We always finish the show with the same two questions. I'm going to ask you those now. The first is, if you had a message for the public, any message, what would it be?
I think the struggle that we've got is that there's too many people in too much of a pickle themselves, that expecting them to back up somebody like myself is completely the wrong. Having a better understanding, we've lost connection with food, very much so. Food is something that is more often than not comes in packaging and is very evolved from the actual farm. If you get out at any point into the countryside and get to a farm that's retailing, selling something from the doorstep, and strike up a conversation with the farmer, there'll be a lot of farmers who won't be happy with that because they're too busy. But that would probably try and reconnect with your food, because it's if you look after your diet, the quality of the food you eat, and it helps you in other ways as well.
And finally, a message for farmers.
One of the things that's lately been, it isn't just farmers, but people involved in farming. More often than not, I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle. It's not at the extremes. And I think that anybody coming to an argument or a discussion needs to appreciate that it's going to be some compromise that's going to be needed to actually find something that's going to give some progress. It may not give the progress overnight or straight away, in the matter of months, but any sort of progress is progress. So that would probably be my thoughts on that.
Brilliant. Richard, thank you so much for coming on the show and giving me some of your time. It's been really interesting to hear about your situation up in Yorkshire. So yeah, some great thoughts today. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for listening as well. That's it for today. Just a heads up, in May, looking ahead a little bit, we'll be running a whole month's worth of shows where we'll be having chefs in conversations with farmers. If you want to nominate anyone to get involved in that, please do just message me on Twitter at @MTF_podcast. But I will see you next time.